started recording. Whatever your period is, if you want to figure out what to count by, and you don't have to count every 1 unit by this, but you could do every 2 units by this, but kind of what values to label that are going to be important, take your period and divide it into those 4 critical intervals. So every critical interval will be 4 pi divided by 4, which is pi. So I'm going to count by, I'm going to kind of label 1 pi, but I'm going to stretch this out so that I use more of the graph. Every 2 units for me is going to stand for pi. And then I'd be at 2 pi. And then I'd be at 3 pi. And then I'd be at 4 pi. So without a phase shift, my cycle is going to start at 0. And it's going to end, of course, 1 period later at 4 pi. Now, this is a sine graph. So do sine graphs start, where do they start? On the midline. So I'm going to definitely, there's where, and I always like to say my function starts there, and where do they end? At the end of the period, but also on the midline, right? Sine graphs look like this. They start and end on the midline. So if I know my period is supposed to end at 4 pi, I'm going to get my end point of this cycle on there as well. I think the starting point and the ending point are a good thing to get on there right away. And then kind of look at your basic sine graph. We hit the midline again halfway in between the start and the end, right? So where would that be? 2 pi, we're going to hit the midline again. Now, is this a positive sign or a negative sign, right? Because there's a difference in which structure we're going to go with. Is it a positive sign or a negative sign? Positive, which means we go up first, right? So we're going to go up to the maximum first, which is going to occur halfway between these points, so at pi. And we already said the maximum is 3, because we have to go up 2 units with the amplitude of 2, and then we'll come back down. And then halfway between these 2 midline points, I have to go down 2 from the midline, which will put me at a minimum of -1. And there's the graph. Okay? And obviously this would then continue. So if they ever say, and sometimes they're specific, sometimes the regents will say graph 1 period only. Sometimes they'll say graph at least 1 period. Okay? We should put arrows on the end because this goes on to infinity. Sometimes they'll say graph 2 periods, in which case I need to extend this. So if the first period goes from 0 to 4 pi, the second cycle would go from 4 pi to 8 pi. And then you would just do kind of 5 pi, 6 pi, 7 pi, 8 pi, and you would make sure it ends at 8 pi, and you have another midline intersection halfway between at 6 pi, and then it would go at 5 pi to its maximum, and at 7 pi to its minimum. You just have to make sure these critical points are all evenly spaced. Your critical points are your maxes, your mins, and your midline hits. So that would be exactly 2 periods. And it's such a silly thing that we have to take points off for, and we're like, oh my God, clearly this person knows how to graph it to perfection, but if it said graph 2 periods of it, you need that as well. Yep. You can. If you wanted to, you wouldn't have to go that way. You could have gone backwards with it if you had put your y-axis like in the middle of the paper. Yep, that part is fine if they don't specify which 2 periods. But maybe they say graph this function on the interval from 0 to 8 pi. If they say that, then you have to do it from 0 to 8 pi, and you have to know that there's 2 cycles within that space. So it depends on how they phrase it, but they could say from -4 pi to +4 pi, which is what you were asking about would be if you went to the left. Okay, any questions? The scales are important when we're grading. We're looking at, did they space things out evenly? Did they count by something that was conducive to the period? Okay, now here's a perfect example, number 2, of how they can ask you to write, to graph an equation without making the calculator helpful for you. they say to graph something like this cosine curve, you can just type this in because they didn't give you the equation. See how they do that? Tricky. They don't give you the equation, so you can't graph it just by plugging it into your calculator. Graph a cosine curve with an amplitude of 3, a frequency. Frequency is what? We'll talk about that again. B. So B equals pi over 2. And a midline at 3. So they don't mention whether or not there's a phase shift. You could insert one if you wanted to, but I don't think anyone in their right mind would make it more complicated by doing that, so we'll just assume that the phase shift is none. Yeah? You can. Yeah, you could do that. You could definitely, and I probably, well, I'm not going to, but I will after I'm finished with it. So since I'm not doing a phase shift, I'm going to keep my y-axis way over. My midline is at 3. So if the midline is at 3 and the amplitude is 3, what's the maximum point? 6. And what's the minimum point? 0, right? If the midline is the middle of the graph, you're going to go up 3 from there, which will bring you to 6, and you're also going to go down 3 from that midline, which will bring you to 0. So do I need negative space? Not there either. So this is pretty much just focusing in on the first quadrant. So I need to make sure this gets up to 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So counting by ones is okay. 1, 2. And then we need our period to help us scale our x-axis. So period equals 2 pi over b. And we already said that b is pi over 2. So how do we simplify 2 pi divided by pi over 2? Do we type it into our calculator? You can. But you have to be very sure you know how to use your calculator appropriately, because if I type in 2 pi divided by pi over 2, what's going to be the problem? What's that? Yeah, it would. It's going to equal 1, but that's not going to be right. Why? Why did I type that in wrong? Yep. You're doing 2 pi, and you're supposed to be dividing by pi over 2. This way, the calculator is just doing order of operations, so it's doing this division first and then taking that answer and dividing by 2. Whereas this one is going to do 2 pi divided by, and it will do this first, which is a different answer. Do you follow? Okay? By hand, if you had to do that, you can keep, change, flip, right? That's the same as 2 pi, keep, change, and flip pi over 2 to 2 over pi, and look what happens. Your pi's cancel, and 2 times 2 is the 4. So if our period is 4, what's 4 split into 4 parts? 1. So we're not counting by pi like we did here. We're literally counting by 1. So again, we can do 1, 2, 3, 4, and that would give us 1 period. Okay, and again, get your midline on there with a dotted line. Now this is a cosine curve. Is it a positive or a negative cosine curve? What makes you say that? That doesn't have anything to do with the positive or negative cosine, because there's a positive cosine curve and there's a negative. You can't tell. You could get away with either. They did not give any descriptive information to let you decipher. If you drew it like this, a negative cosine, you'd still have an amplitude of 3. You still could do your period appropriately with 4 and a midline at 3. Either way is actually fine here. I'll do a negative cosine curve just to be the devil's advocate. I think most people would just do the positive when in doubt. They really didn't give enough information here. So I can start at a minimum, which, where is my minimum again? 0. So I start with this point, and I'm going to end with this point, and the end point is going to be 1 period later, also at a minimum, which would be here. Those are my 2 minimums. my maximum is going to occur at what x value? What x value? 2. My maximum is going to happen halfway in between, and it will be at a y value of 6. And then I have to cross the midline somewhere in between, and I want to be specific about where. So if my minimum is at 0 and my maximum is at 2, where's my midline cross? 1. And between the max and the min, between 2 and 4, where's my midline cross? 3. Now, I'm scaling it so that those points are there. If they're not there, if you didn't scale it and you couldn't divide your period by 4 nicely, you can kind of estimate, but try to have it be a pretty good estimate because we are always looking for 5 critical points. And then there's our cosine curve. Okay? The next one brings it to another level because there is a phase shift here. However, you know how our format is this? That's our format. Your parentheses have to start with x, and these parentheses do not. So we have to factor out whatever this is. Okay? This is not our phase shift until x is the lead of the parentheses. So this is very new to you. You have to factor out the 1/2. So that is your b, but your phase shift is not 1 pi units to the right. Okay? When you divide out 1/2 from 1, what do you get? 1 dividing by 1/2. 2. So this is actually minus 2 pi. So now we can clearly see what A is, amplitude equals 3. What B is, B equals 1/2. We'll find our period in a second. Phase shift, 2 pi units to the right. And then midline is at -2. Which I probably should have written next to the amplitude because those kind of work together. So let's think about scaling our y-axis. If our midline is at -2 and our amplitude is 3, what's our maximum? 1. And what's our minimum? -5. So we actually need negative space here. We can go up to 1. Right? So 1, 2, and then we can go down -1, -2, -3, -4, -5, and get your midline at -2. Now, this graph got shifted 2 pi units to the right, so I definitely don't need any negative space. Before we can scale our x-axis, we need to find our period. So I'm going to do that. Period equals 2 pi over my b value of 1/2. What's that? What's 2 pi divided by 1/2? How many times does 1/2 go into 2? 4. So 4 pi. Our pi's did not cancel here. So our period is 4 pi. And we can divide that into 4 parts evenly so we can count by pi's. So that works out well. The problem is our cycle isn't starting until 2 pi. So I'm going to count by pi's. 1 pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi, 5 pi, 6 pi, 7 pi, 8 pi. I don't know how. I'll just go to 10 pi and see what happens. So my cycle isn't starting until here, which is a little off. It's going to kind of be floating in the middle. Yes? And is this a positive or negative cosine? positive. So we're starting at a maximum point. So we're starting our cycle at an x value of 2 pi because of the shift right 2 pi units. And what is the maximum? 1. That's because the midline is at -2 and we have to start 3 units above that. So if the cycle is starting at 2 pi and my period is 4 pi units long, where's it going to end? Grace says 6 pi. Do we buy that? That's correct. Because there has to be 4 pi units between your starting point and your ending point. So there are my 2 maximums. Where then is my minimum going to occur? At a y value of -5, but where in terms of my x coordinate? 4 pi, halfway between those. So our minimum has to be 3 amplitudes below the midline. 3 units below the midline. And then my midline intersections are going to happen there and there. Between 2 and 4 is 3, and between 4 and 6 is 5. And then here is 1 period. Now this, to me, would be one where they might say graph it on the interval from 0 to 6 pi. So you would have to kind of trace this backwards. So where would the next point be? So see how there's 1 unit in between each of these? 1 horizontal unit between here and here. So if I go 1 horizontal unit backwards, I'm at the midline. And 1 horizontal unit back from there, I should be at a minimum. You know what I wouldn't doubt? If they gave you something like this and asked you to write another version of that equation. Write another equation for this same function. And you could bring it back to the original and you could write the same function, except for this would be a negative cosine with no phase shift. Yes? So that would be like an interesting, like 4 6-point question. Okay? We're not obviously not going to have time to do number 4, but very quickly, what's our amplitude? 1. Amplitude's always positive, but when we do graph it, it will be a negative sine curve. The B, is there a phase shift? No. The B value is 2 pi, so our period is 2 pi over 2 pi. What's that? 1. That's interesting, because if I have to cut a period of 1 into 4 parts, I should be counting by 1/4. So when I do this, and you don't have to do this, just watch. My midline's what, -2? When I count, I'm going to maybe count by 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, and then 4/4. So that's 1, right? So the length of my period will start at 0 and end at 1, and then I'll have it nice and evenly spaced so I can go halfway between things. And then my midline is -2. Okay, so it's sine. I start on my midline, I end on my midline, and I have a halfway point on my midline. And this goes down by an amplitude of 1 and up by an amplitude of 1. And so very quickly to finish, that looks like that. So your homework is just the 4 examples on the back of this worksheet. Obviously not a lot, but there's a lot that goes into each problem. So use your calculator only to check. You're really focusing on scaling.